Hi guys, this is Hirosaki. This story is all about what if Naruto created a spy network with his shadow clones. WIP and unconscious Iruka forces Naruto to return to the academy for another year. It also marks the beginnings of a prank whose far-reaching consequences will shake Konoha to its foundations. Before we start, kindly like and subscribe to this channel, and look over the description box for the author of this amazing storyline. Welcome aboard. Chapter 27, Aftermath. Prank Day 176. The last remaining member of the fifth clone group didn't know what to do. He could hear chains clanking to the ground and could see the distant form of something rising under a tarp at the far end of the room, but didn't know how to react. He had no clue what jutsu the man had just performed. Should he go and secure the man's body? Was it a decoy? Beside him, the newly arrived group of Kage Bunshin took position, a pair even readying black spheres. Sorry to keep you waiting. Shukuin's voice rang out, the laughter somehow continuing in tandem with his words. The giant form took a step forward, causing the cloth covering to fall to the ground behind it. He could tell with a glance that this monster, not the patchwork beasts from before, was the goal of whatever horrible research was going on here. It stood just inches shorter than the ceiling, was thicker than the oldest trees, and was crisscrossed with the black sticks the clones had come to associate with the chimeras in this place. Like the chimeras, he had more limbs than was natural. 2 extra pair of mismatched arms jutted from the sides of the thing's chest, while a heavy tail like that of a lizard trailed behind him. There were eyes everywhere, from its stomach to its elbows, and its feet ended in things more akin to talons than to regular toes. Worse, however, was its head. It was like someone had tried smashing 5 different faces together, then had said close enough before giving up. It had more noses than mouths, and it had several of those, and he suspected the scattering of mismatched eyes stretched all the way around to the back of his head. Its cranium was abnormally large, as if it had more than one brain, and various animal ears twitched in every direction from the top of its scalp. The laughter stopped. So, like what you see? The many mouths exclaimed in a bizarre echo. The clones were too shocked to answer. This was the biggest thing they'd ever fought, save the giant serpents during the invasion, and those had required special measures that weren't currently available. With the armor-like plates that were clearly visible and the chains swinging from the biggest arms, it was a clear contender for the title of physically strongest foe that the many Narutos had ever faced. Most skilled wasn't a question. Orochimaru. Well? The monster asked. We've waited long enough. At those words, it barged toward them with ground-eating strides. Everyone reacted instantly. Those with spheres threw them forward while the rest responded with the first jutsu that came to mind. The beast ignored the blinding flashes, and a wave of its chains took out the few clones who'd countercharged, intent on electrocuting the thing. The member of the fifth group, however, did a quick kawarini backwards out of the room. It wasn't that he was retreating, no. It was just that the creature's bulk was larger than the door, which meant his new position would give him the advantage. His thoughts were interrupted by the sounds of hands clapping together. That was when the entire room's floor turned into jutting spikes, instantly dispelling all the other clones. Oh, it could use jutsu too. Thinking quickly, the last Bunshin arrived at a decision. Hey, you muscle-bound brute, it yelled, grabbing the thing's attention. You can't catch me. It screamed, adding an obscene gesture to the mix. He then ran off in the opposite direction from which he'd originally come. He hadn't made much distance before the beast burst through the too small door as if it weren't there. Luckily, the corridors were smaller than the room had been, which should slow him down some. Doton, Dumantapa. It yelled, slamming its hands on the walls. Or not, the Bunshin thought as the corridor doubled in size. He didn't stop, yelling insults and the like as he continued running. He gained some more breathing room as the thing turned to send a bolt of lightning to intercept clones coming from the other way, but lost more as the creature quickly caught up. With his stride, he covered ground nearly twice as fast, and quick replacements weren't useful in the dark and twisting corridors. His play for time was rewarded a few minutes later when a quick memory message arrived. An exit had been found. Better yet, it was on the opposite side of the complex. A confirmation came the next second from the team defending the real Naruto, along with new orders for the clone groups. Orders that he very much agreed with. Trusting the others to do their jobs, he turned left at the next junction, preparing a quick sphere. The Bunshin fired it as soon as the monster came into sight, then resumed running without looking at the results. Behind him, the sound of the beast's chakra-reinforced chains intercepting the incoming projectile was followed by the sphere's premature detonation. A quick jutsu widened the corridor, and the chase was back on. That was how things went for the next few minutes. The clone kept the thing's attention with insults and quick techniques, all the while ignoring the man's words. He made sure not to provide too obvious of a target after a lightning bolt nearly took off his head, but outside of that he kept to his role. Which meant that, once he got the message he'd been waiting for, he circled back to a very specific location. He ignored the man's taunts as he did so. He knew that he was running out of chakra, but he had more than enough to last until his role was done. He ran straight through the next junction, looking back only at the last instant. Which meant he didn't miss the look on the face of his foe as dozens of clones fired streams of flame at him from every direction. He didn't get the look he'd expected. No eyes widening in surprise, no scowls, no fervent denials. Just him coming to a stop in an instant, while a pair of hands, the middle ones this time, he noticed, quickly formed seals. Doton, Hirato, he announced simply. The clone then knew no more. The Kage Bunshin leading the group defending the real Naruto, along with the other two genin, winced as the memories of multiple dying clones hit him. Their last moments weren't very revealing, only informing the Bunshin that it was a Doton technique that had ended them. Turning around, once he opened his eyes, was much more informative. On the east side of the village, there was a crater-like depression, easily 25 meters wide. The main part of it was in the street, but a good chunk of a nearby field had also been destroyed, and there was now a building which was missing a wall and, as such, was in danger of crumbling. The hope that their foe had died in the ambush regardless of its last move were dashed when the beast burst from the center of the crater. It wasn't unharmed, having some burns here and there, but it was still clearly mobile and able to fight. He didn't wait a moment before sending out new orders, as everyone still alive below was needed up here, pronto. The numbers of Bunshin that responded as the monstrous creature climbed out of the crater it was in didn't reassure the leading clone one bit. They were left with fewer than 100 clones. While the ones defending Naruto had charged up as much as they could while waiting for an exit, that still didn't leave them with much to work with. Now what? One of the clones who just arrived asked. The leader didn't have a ready answer. Crawling out of the broken remains of the corridor he'd been in, Shokuen shook his head and got his bearings. He'd been having so much fun testing the limits of his creation that he'd lost track of time. The ambush had been an unpleasant wake-up call. He'd been injured somewhat before taking the clones down, but nothing serious. Eyes and skin were easily replaced, and the grudge compensated for the rest. He had to admit, this was the longest he'd worked this body, and it responded as well as he'd expected, if not better. He was glad to see his masterpiece deserve the name. Anyway, he'd played long enough, time to take down whatever foes were left. Taking a deep breath with his two pairs of lungs, Shokuen focused on sensing his adversaries. The difference between his original body and this one made the exercise somewhat difficult, but after a few moments he had a fair enough feel for the surrounding chakra. And better yet, he could still detect his tracking seals. While he'd not taken the time to install said seals on the prisoners, those made it easy to ignore the various tagged villagers to focus on the real targets. He wasn't surprised to find a number of them crowded together inside the inn, one of the most available exits led into its basement. A quick shunshin brought him right to the door, where he spat out a bolt of lightning at the biggest grouping of chakra signatures. He took down at least 3, while the rest spread out in a burst of chakra he associated with the replacement technique. He followed that with another flat earth jutsu, leveling the building and bursting the numerous clones still in the corridors below. There hadn't been anything other than storage rooms close to this exit, so nothing of importance was lost. Jumping clear of the falling building, Shokuen tracked his remaining targets. 17 left, he noted, no 18, he then amended as another clone popped into existence. The scientist didn't hesitate, charging the summoner. Whoever this ninja was, his reserves had to be giving out. They were running out of clones. The clone who'd taken charge of things had been lucky enough to evade the first bolt of lightning, and he'd taken position on top of the mayor's house, after a pair of quick kawarimi, to keep himself aware of the flow of battle. They were losing. Worse was how clear it was. By now, the clones fought in ones and twos, trying to buy time. Below, a pair of clones had the beast in a pincer, looking for an opening where they could use their spheres to full effect. So far, said opening wasn't forthcoming. They'd tried just about everything. Their blinding technique wasn't affecting it, and the creature wasn't leaving them time to set up a tornado. Getting close enough to shock it was basically impossible, as it didn't have any blind spot they could take advantage of, and the thing had the blatant Hellfire's measure, dodging it without fail. Their last main technique, their water jutsu, was just an invitation for a lightning bolt, as they'd found out the hard way. It even had some form of close-ranged electric surge, which meant that grabbing on and draining it wasn't an option. Disarming it of those chains had first seemed a possibility, but they'd learned that the things were more solid than expected. They resisted high heat and didn't channel lightning, which meant another avenue of attack was cut off. Frankly, the best they could do was buy time. That and flee, but Ebisu was still trapped below, along with a few clones, and they weren't going to abandon their teacher to his fate. He knew they had reinforcements incoming, if not what they were, but he was afraid they wouldn't make much of a difference. He made a sudden realization as two clones below fell to the creature's Earth Spikes jutsu. The Naruto clones only had two ways of taking down enemies. One was quick takedowns with forbidden techniques, which had been the staple of individual ninja during the invasion, and the second was outlasting whoever they were battling, like they did against Gaara. Unfortunately, this beast seemed like it would be the one outlasting them this time. A quick replacement saved him from a bolt of lightning, depositing him on the other side of the road, while another clone tried to use the opening to slam a flaming sphere right in the creature's leg. He wasn't fast enough though, as the opponent managed a quick shunshin to emerge unscathed. That's all you can do. The same techniques over and over? The thing yelled in his bizarre echoing voice. Pathetic. Also insulting was the fact that the thing had started on a critique of their combat style, analyzing each and every technique that came its way and pointing out their flaws. Most of them were already well known by the clones, which only made it more grating. 7 left, it pointed out. With 3 of that unconscious, which probably means that they are the real ones. Shit. Time to end this. He then started chaining lightning bolts one after the other, targeting them with unerring precision. His 3 pairs of arms somehow allowed him to use 3 copies of the same technique at once. All the clones started replacing themselves repeatedly, hoping to delay the inevitable. One lasted 2 jumps before getting hit, while another vanished out of chakra depletion after the 5th. The 2 left looked at each other from opposite sides of the street, sharing a meaningful glance, then shifted to the road proper. If they were going to be falling, better to go out fighting. A ninja to the last. It said, and Naruto could find a note of contempt in its voice. How unsurprising. The one formerly leading prepared for a charge, hoping to land at least a final attack, when a message arrived. Incoming. He nearly mistimed his jump and fell prey to the field of spikes because of that. His compatriot wasn't as lucky, being burst on the spot. Which was when a giant toad fell straight on the thing. It was at least 4 times as big as the beast, and squashed it to the ground instantly. It didn't manage to kill it though. No. It yelled. I won't be defeated so easily. Glowing from visibly chakra-reinforced strength, he started pushing himself to freedom. Rasengan. The toad sage disappeared from the summon's back, only to reappear right above the man. In his hand was a glowing sphere of chakra, making a whirring noise like dozens of buzzsaws acting in unison. Before the beast could do anything, Jiraiya smashed the ball straight into his chin, pushing through without any resistance. The monster's head was blown to pieces instantly, and it fell back under the giant toad's mass. The last Kagebunshin fell to the ground in a heap. After the long battle they'd gone through, such an end felt pretty anticlimactic, but he was glad for Jiraiya's presence. This was the closest the clones had been to actually dying off, and that would have been the best scenario. With what they'd found, the man might have kept the real Naruto alive for his experiments, but he was sure he wouldn't have made the same mistake twice. "You okay?" Jiraiya asked as he stepped forward. What was clearly a female Naruto clone was right behind him, appearing with a kawarimi. "Give me enough time to drain some chakra, and I'll be fine," the Bunshin replied, rising. "Clone then," the Sannin noted. "The original?" "Give me a second and I'll lead you to him," he said, flashing his hands in the seals necessary for chakra drain. He maybe had one replacement left in him before he burst, and this wasn't the time to take risks. Naruto came back to consciousness for the second time that day, and was happy to see that he wasn't chained up or imprisoned this time. Inside his head, however, he had images fighting each other for supremacy, and he wasn't able to make heads or tails of whatever had gone on. As such, he shook his head and rose. Being that he didn't seem to be captive, he'd be able to get answers quickly enough. His rising quickly drew attention, and he found himself with the rest of his team save Ebisu. 2 clones were also present, along with, for some reason, his spying teacher Jiraiya. He focused on the last. "I'm surprised to see you here. You think I'd let one of my students fall against some Orochimaru wannabe?" He replied with a smile. "I was on my way as soon as I heard," he then continued in a more serious vein. "And thank God for him." The only Naruto clone dressed in his normal orange jumpsuit added. "Without him, we'd probably have been done for." Naruto scowled. "How bad?" He quickly looked to the side at his other clones. They seemed perfectly fine, but they might have slept through the battle like he had. There was however one conspicuous absence that gave Naruto shivers. Did something happen to Ebisu? The Naruto clone shook his head. "He's fine. His pride will probably be the worst hit." "Where is he then?" "He's still out," Jiraiya replied. "And he should be back up in a few hours. I could probably wake him up, but I'm not a medic Nin. Better he regains consciousness normally than what I do." "Good," Naruto replied with a smile. "I suppose you're like us and want an update, correct?" Ariko asked, caressing the still sleeping Ichibo. "I'm not the only one with scrambled memories, I suppose," Naruto said. Both Muramaru and Ariko nodded enthusiastically at that. The group sat down as Naruto's Kagebunshin went through his tale. Judging by Jiraiya's reactions, he had already gone through this once. He nodded in all the right places and asked for further clarifications on various points. As the story advanced, Naruto scowled more and more. It was clear that, without Jiraiya's timely arrival, they would have been done for. "You were lucky. From what I can tell, the man wasn't really a ninja," Jiraiya said as the tale was in its last parts. "If he'd had the relevant experience along with that powerful body, and his elemental ninjutsu, he'd have been an S-ranked fighter quite probably." Yeah, Naruto replied a few moments after the clone finished. "Still, that doesn't feel like a victory, even if we're the last one standing." Everyone nodded at that. "There'll be battles like that through your entire career," Jiraiya added, nodding wisely. "I should know, I went through my share of them. In fact, I owe the title of Sannin to a battle that, even now, years after the fact, still feels like a loss." "You mean the one against Hanzo the Salamander?" Muramaru asked. "Yes," the Toad Sage confirmed. "Orochimaru, Tsunade and I survived, and that's the best we can say about that fight." The fact that the title we received spread far and wide after the battle only added salt to the wound. He scowled at the reminder. Still, you're all still alive, and your enemies are defeated. Maybe the results aren't what you'd hoped for, but take your victories where you can get them. As long as you live and learn, that's the important part of it. Naruto nodded, as did every clone. They all had things that needed improvement fast, and various ideas on how to do so. How about? Naruto started. Jiraiya stopped him with a raised hand. There'll be more than enough time to discuss this later, and that's the kind of job that's tailor-made for that council of yours. Think about it, and we'll discuss it back home. There are more important things right now. Like what? Naruto asked. You're up for making shadow clones? The Sannin countered, rising. How many do you need? Naruto replied as he followed suit. As many as you can give me, the man said, pointing toward the village. I'll use Earth Jutsu to open up the sealed entrances, but I'll need hands to empty the place. That stuff needs to move pronto, especially if Orochimaru has anything interesting here, and somehow got a warning. Even the... Naruto gulped as an image flashed in his mind. The bodies? I might take a few of the more complete ones back to Konoha for studying by specialists, but outside of that, no, the Toad Sannin replied. I'll build a pyre some distance from the village and we'll burn whatever's left. I don't want anything that could be found by any sort of scavengers. Right. Naruto nodded, followed by his clones. A moment later, the clearing they were in was filled with copies of the orange-wearing blonde. So, where do we start? He asked. This time, Ebisu was happy to note, there was no scratching of quills or scathing comments as he came to. He was also untied, still clad only in his boxers, and in what seemed like a bed. He might have thought the previous time a dream if not for the few incisions the Shukuin had done that were still hurting him. Still, there was no reason to play possum. The first thing he noted was that this wasn't his in-room. The second was the slowing descending sun he could see outside the window. The third was the fact that Jiraiya of the Sannin was standing at his bedside while writing something down in a book. Jiraiya-sama! He exclaimed, shooting upwards. He then realized that bowing from a lying position was basically impossible, and couldn't figure out what to do. At ease, at ease. The Sannin replied, closing his book. How are you feeling? Ebisu twisted around some as a test, and found nothing wrong outside the few cuts. Nothing that would prevent me from doing my duty. Good, the sage said, turning his chair toward the bed. I'd like your report on what happened in the village. The special jonin shrank a little. Could I be informed of the status of my students? He asked. Jiraiya simply smiled. They're all fine. They actually did very good for their rank, managing to escape the place by themselves. If it hadn't been for the trouble they'd stirred, I might not have found this place at all. That was the story the group had agreed would be the public version of what had happened. Those in the know would get the full report, but Naruto hadn't seen any reason to reveal everything to his sensei. He didn't doubt the man would treat him properly anymore, but he liked the different ways Ebisu interacted with every one of his clones. Thank the kami. Ebisu said, lowering his head. After a moment of silence, he looked straight at the Sannin and nodded. Where should I start? When you arrived in Fumotocho would be the best. Ebisu then went over everything. It was a little shameful to admit how easily he'd been taken down to anyone, but Jiraiya was a superior, and he would have to go through this anyway with the Hokage later. Jiraiya was silent as the special jonin went over every word the man who'd captured him had said, and kept so minutes after the discussion had ended, clearly deep in thought. Could I ask something, Jiraiya-sama? Ebisu finally said, breaking the silence. That broke the Sannin out of his thoughts. Go ahead. Am I unworthy as a teacher? The Toad Sage's eyes widened in surprise. What brought that on? I'm only a special jonin, and I've never even been invited to the Jonin trials, Ebisu replied. I'm still behind the rest of my teammates in basically every domain, while they're higher ranked than me. His face fell deeper. The day I met Naruto, he beat my shadow clone easily, and I'm pretty sure he was holding back. And now, someone who isn't even a ninja got the best of me. He took a deep breath, choking back a sob. Should I just give up and give my team to someone else? Jiraiya smirked sadly. I know that feeling so well, you haven't a clue. What? Ebisu replied, shocked. How do you think it was, being in a team with Tsunade and Orochimaru? The Sannin replied. The last Senju and a born genius? But you're Jiraiya of the Sannin. I wasn't always that, he pointed out. And even then, I still failed. Tell me, who were my students? The Yondaime, of course, the special Jonin replied. And who were the two other members of that genin team? Ebisu started, opened his mouth, then closed it without saying a word. Thought as much. Jiraiya nodded sadly. They never amounted to much. One died during his second Chunin exam, while the other was a genin all his life until the Kyuubi claimed him. And Minato was a genius like I've never seen. Even to this day I wonder if he didn't end up so skilled in spite of me. He raised his eyes, looking toward the ceiling. I said the same to my own teacher Hirozen, and he told what I'll now tell you. Jiraiya went silent for a moment, for emphasis. Ask your students. But they. Ebisu started, only to be interrupted. They know better than you think, the Sannin said. Sometimes, there are things that can only be seen from the outside. And they may be young, but they notice more than you realize. He rose. I'll leave you to your thoughts. Anyway, I have more than enough paperwork to go through. He then walked out. Ebisu stood there in his bed for a few minutes before rising himself. It couldn't hurt to hear his team's opinion, and it was their team as well as his. They should be allowed their say at the very least. It didn't take much time for Ebisu to find his way down in the tunnels under the city, and the many Narutos there going back and forth were always happy to give him directions. He found his 3 genin in the largest room he'd seen, huddled around a blond man on the ground. Said man was still breathing but seemed unconscious somehow. They also hadn't noticed his arrival. Good evening, students. Sensei. The 3 exclaimed as they turned. Glad to see you're all right, Muramaru added, to which everyone else, including the rabbit on Ariko's head, nodded. I feel the same way, the man replied, then took a deep breath. No reason to wait. He then bowed. You three have my most sincere excuses for the deplorable consequences of my weakness, he said clearly, not looking up. I feel that I failed all of you today, and allowed you to be captured due to my own negligence. Wait, Sensei, Naruto replied, raising both hands up. We didn't do any better. Ichibo here probably has a better nose than the 4 of us combined, and even he detected the poison too late. Ebisu shook his head. That may be, but I am still your Jonin sensei. It is on my shoulder that your protection lies, and I've failed in that mission shamefully. He took another breath. Should you request it, I will ensure this team finds a better sensei to fill my post. You 3 have a great future ahead of you, and I would not want to be the one holding you back. He then fell silent and waited for his judgment. Nope. Naruto was the first to reply. Nope. There's no giving up, not in this team. Yeah, Muramaru continued. Why would we want to get rid of you? You could find much better teachers. A Taijutsu specialist would be of much more help in developing Muramaru's family style, while both Kenjutsu and Ninjutsu masters would be glad to have you, Naruto, as a student. And I know an Inuzuka Jonin who I'm sure would be interested on how their jutsu could work with Ichibo here. We'd much prefer if you stayed, Sensei, Ariko said, and Ichibo nodded at that. And we're more than happy with the things you're teaching us. Like the illusions you started me on. The female clone didn't have them down yet, but it was only a matter of time. Or the sensing exercises, Niramaru added. I already have a ninjutsu teacher, and a kenjutsu teacher, and even a trapping teacher, which I have to thank you for, he said with a nod. I'd prefer a sensei I can trust with what I want to do with my life. Yeah. Niramaru added. And anyway, if you think you're not strong enough, just train until you're satisfied with yourself. Naruto exclaimed. What about your own training? The teacher replied. How will I be in charge of it if I'm away practicing? A shadow clone is more than enough for teaching, most of the time, sensei, Naruto pointed out. I wouldn't mind, Iruka added, to which Niramaru nodded. Ebisu was silent for a moment. Are you certain of your decision? All the genin nodded. Then the matter is closed, he said with finality. I'll leave you to your work. He glanced back down. Who is that, anyway? The one in charge is of this place, Naruto replied. He used a bizarre technique to take control of one of the spare bodies lying around. He indicating the surroundings with a wave of his hand, where some of the spare bodies were still present. And fell to the ground like this. We're not sure what to do with him, since he's still alive. I see, the sensei replied. Well, there are mind specialists in Konoha, which may be able to extract some valuable information. Having him transported might very well be worth it. Okay, Naruto replied, going to the walls to find something to bind the captive. Ebisu simply made his way out of the room as he did so. Then he smiled. He'd been afraid for nothing. Walking back toward the exit, he found himself accosted by a trio of clones carrying the most bizarre beast. A second followed a little later, with more still coming. Curious, he went to the source, and found piles of deceased chimeras like those he'd already seen. Now, he wasn't specialized in autopsies, but he knew enough to tell that the many monsters here had been electrocuted to death. All of them, it seemed. That was bizarre, since the only lightning user he'd heard about was these beasts' master. Jiraiya wasn't one, and the one member of his team who knew any elemental jutsu was Naruto with his fire technique. In fact, looking around, he could see the results of the boy's technique. The melted hinges were especially illuminating in that regard, especially since the room on the other side was clearly a cell. Which meant his team had been right in this place. Something was wrong here. The special Jonin took a deeper look and quickly found something else. Remains of broken arrows could be found all over, as if someone had been shooting at the people here. Taking that all together meant something even more fishy. His team was hiding something from him. Chapter 28, Homecoming. Prank Day 177. Another batch of scrolls, Arrow Sennin, Naruto said, coming out of the former laboratory. Beside him, Niramaru and Iruka unloaded their own burdens, adding to Naruto's pile. I told you not to call me that. The man replied, taking the top document and quickly going over it. One of Jiraiya's shadow clones sitting beside the man did the same with a second scroll. Why can't you call me sensei, like most students do? Well, the name fits, Niramaru pointed out. You can't deny that, Mr. Super Pervert. And we already have a sensei, in case you didn't notice, Iruka continued, indicating Ebisu with a wave of her hand. The special Jonin was in charge of the pyre, and by the scowl on his face, he didn't like the job any more than the many Narutos would have. Jiraiya tossed the rolled-up scroll onto one of the piles behind him. Yeah. And how is it going downstairs? We're more than halfway done, Naruto replied. Unless there's another archive down there, we should be finished before the end of the day. That was the reason why they were still in Fumotocho. Jiraiya was adamant that the place had to be emptied before they all left, and everyone agreed with him. But Shukuen had been a scientist, which meant reams of documents and notes about both the running of this place and the experiments that had been performed therein. Going through that was a long process, especially since Jiraiya, or one of his clones, had to go through every document first. As the highest-ranked Konoha ninja in Fumotocho, it was his decision if scrolls had to be sealed from view, so he had to check them all. From there they went into multiple piles, where Naruto clones stacked, ordered and indexed them. They even sometimes copied them, as the Toad Sannin had given them leave to copy whatever jutsu scrolls weren't sealed by his order. The Uruhara library would be growing quite a bit once they were back in Konoha. The three genin were on their way back down when Jiraiya exclaimed. "Finally!" "Yes?" Ariko asked, turning around. The Sannin held up the scroll in his hands. "I was waiting for this one. It has the technical specifications for the combined tracking/control seal that was used on the villagers in this place." Said villagers were still under the seal, hiding from the ninjas. They hadn't said a word yet, and Naruto suspected that was part of their restrictions. "It even has instructions on how to perform the counter seal, which'll save me from having to build one." He looked at the three genin. "Any of you have experience in seals?" Naruto stepped forward after a moment. "Tekuno has started me on building explosive and smoke tags," he offered. The other two shook their heads, confident that Jiraiya would understand the meaning. "Okay, well, you have to start somewhere." "Come here, Naruto," the Sannin said, indicating a spot beside him as he withdrew his sealing equipment. The blonde genin did so. "Now." Jiraiya started, taking the tone Naruto associated with the Sannin teaching. Counter seals are seal made to affect other seals. It's one of the most complex branches of Fuinjutsu, as seals often contain elements that would react to tampering. He pointed down at the scroll before him. That one was clearly made for easy removal, which means that it has very little that stops one from taking it off. Now, the main part of a counter seal is this one, which has to target the active part of the Fuinjutsu one is trying to remove. This is the capital part because. Prank Day 179. "So, anything urgent to report?" The merchant clone in charge, seated at the end of the table, asked. Silence was his answer. "Good. Meeting 63 then. First up is the trading network itself. How are things going?" "We're up by 17 contacts since last meeting, mostly in sand and water countries," a bunshin on the left replied, his nose in a book. "Added to that are a few dozens possible suppliers, especially in fish products. We also have our first contact with a purveyor of Suna steel." "Good. No issue there?" The clone shook his head in answer, as did his three assistants. "Perfect then. Point 2, trade in Konoha. What's happening there?" "We're losing customers in Konoha," the Leaf Village representative said. Everyone turned toward him in a flash. "Come again?" "Over the last week, 3 different shops cancelled their standing orders with us, and that without any stated reason," Janae explained. "I tried going to see the shop owners and question myself, but was given excuses or faced with a closed door." "Did Ichiraku?" One started. "No," Janae answered near instantly. "In fact, our orders from Tucci and the other restaurateurs having only gotten larger, as did those from Jiraiya's contacts. It's the latest customers suggested by Tucci that went and cancelled their orders." There was silence for a moment. "Did you talk to the man himself?" The clone in charge finally asked. "Not yet." Jinae replied, and Ine beside his shook her head negatively. "The one time I went to Ichiraku, the man was absent, and I focused more on the shopkeepers themselves rather than the man who'd suggested them." "Do that," the leader said, and nods all around the table echoed his decision. "How about outside Konoha?" "There, trade is slowly picking up, at least in most places," a shadow clone from the other side of the table replied. "The merchants in Jincho certainly aren't, but Suna is quickly becoming our biggest secondary market," the man added with a smile. Right next to him, the pair of clones in charge of grass scowled. Naruto clones were competitive, if nothing else. "It's at least that," the leader pointed out. "Now, last point, and the most important. What's happening with our saboteurs?" There were scowls all around. Difficult to say, the clone opposite the leader replied. We lost 3 suppliers since last meeting. One we're pretty sure is enemy action, since the man's fishing boats burned to the ground, but the other 2 were less certain. The first saying it's a bad harvest, which may be due to the wet climate in the last few weeks in that region, and the other may simply be a late shipment. There were nods all around. And our defensive measures? They're slowly advancing, the Bunshin finally replied. Our quick reaction teams are ready, but getting clones close to our various suppliers is a work in progress. Most of those places aren't hiring, and that makes having inconspicuous watchers around 24/7 somewhat difficult. We do have a few places covered, at least, and we'll keep working on it. Do that, the copy in charge confirmed. Any other business that needs to be gone over? Silence answered him again. Meeting adjourned then. Next one is next week at location 17. Let's go, people. Prank day 182. We looted all the documents we could find, along with all the jutsu information there was. They're in the 2nd and 3rd scroll. The Sannin indicated those with his hands. The 4th contains a few examples of Shukuan's work, in case Konoha's medics wanted to go over them. The last in the body of Shukuan himself. You may want to have Inoichi go over it. There may be more information about Orochimaru's plans and methods in the man's brain. We left the building intact behind, as taking it down would remove the town from the map. Sending a team specialized in fortifications or demolitions in that direction would be a good idea, for my guess. Ebisu did not react outwardly at the incomplete report being given, but he was thinking furiously inside. What was being hidden? Based on his previous findings, he guessed that either his team was hiding part of their skills, or that there was another person involved in his team's escape. He'd thought about it along the way home, and those 2 options were the ones that made the most sense. Especially considering that Naruto was the Kyuubi's prison, and as such could be the target of enemy actions and kidnapping attempts. But which of the 2 was it? Whichever it was, it didn't reflect well on him. If one of his students was a plant, he'd gone on teaching a false genin for weeks without realizing it. While Konoha had some quite decent infiltrators, the idea that he might not have noticed such a thing hurt his pride as a teacher. If that was the truth, then he would never live down the shame. The fact that Naruto would have a guardian angel would hurt his pride less, but would still sting. He knew he wasn't the greatest of shinobi, but the idea that he'd been under watch at all times without a single inkling, that ate him inside a bit. What could he do about it? Good work, the Hokage said as he put down the scroll in his hand. The special Jonin pushed back the thoughts he'd been having, and focused on the present. You'll all be credited your C-rank mission, along with an extra A-rank mission for the takedown of one of Orochimaru's bases. Everyone smiled at that. I'm also ordering 2 days off your regular team training for recovery. You've been 2 weeks on mission, you deserve a few days of rest to compensate. Yes, yes, Naruto exclaimed. Beside him, both of his other students smiled. Now, dismissed, the Sandaime said with a nod. Jiraiya, stay behind. I have some more questions for you. Ebisu bowed, as did his students, and the 4 of them made their way out of the tower in silence. The special Jonin then directed them to a cafe close to the tower, and sat them down at a booth. I'll be quick, since I suspect everyone is anxious to get back to their own homes, he said once everyone was seated. Good work, team. The mission might not have gone as expected, but you all reacted professionally to the changes, and came through as needed. While I'll be waiting some time before asking for a second C rank, I have no complaints with your work outside the village, and I know you'll do Konoha proud in your following missions as well. He pushed back the fact that there was a secret between them to the back of his mind. Based on what he'd guessed, they might have been ordered to silence, and pushing for more information might even be treasonous in this case. Make sure to keep in shape, and we'll see each other on Friday. He bowed his head as a salute, and waved. Dismissed. His students made their goodbyes, each going in their own direction. Ebisu himself took the time to drink a good coffee and pondered what to do. Between his abysmal performance against Shukuen and the fact that there might be a plant on or near his team, it was clear his skills were deficient. He'd not noticed before, because he'd coasted on his talents as a teacher and, while they hadn't atrophied, his skills as a ninja certainly hadn't improved much in the last few years. He'd been content that way once, but no longer. He needed to play catch-up. The worst thing was, he had a good idea how to accomplish such a thing. It would hurt, both physically and mentally, but it was the best way to go at it. The Hokage hadn't prohibited training, only doing so as a team, and soonest started, soonest done. As such, he drained the last of his coffee in a single swig, and stepped outside into the evening air. While it was late for most people's training, he knew from experience where he could find the person he needed at this hour. He went straight for the wall and climbed up, then waited. He didn't have to do so for long. Before the minute was done, a pair of silhouettes appeared in the distance. At the speed they were going, it was but a moment before they passed Ebisu, and he forced himself to follow them. "Yash, teammate," Guy said as Ebisu fell into step beside him. "Are you here to see the youth of Konoha flourish in the dusk of the day?" he asked. The man clearly hadn't changed a bit. "Not exactly," the special jonin replied, forcing himself to maintain the pace. "I was hoping to talk to you instead." Guy nodded seriously. "Lee, double pace," he yelled, and his student instantly increased his rhythm. Guy instead slowed down, stopping a little later near one of the newly repaired parts of the wall. "Now, what can I do for you, Ebisu?" said Ninja. Took a deep breath to center himself before speaking. "I need to get stronger." Guy simply smiled and nodded. "Let's get to it then." "Okay, that's done," Naruto said as the merchant network representative sat back down. "Then, let's get to the meat of this meeting. GG, I suppose Jiraiya updated you with the full story?" "He did. Everyone else not clear on the happenings in Fumotocho?" he continued. Everyone shook their heads, having been included in the latest mass update. Naruto had informed Iruka straight after leaving the rest of his team, even before said update was done. So, it's clear, it was sheer luck that Jiraiya arrived on time to save our backsides that day. Naruto inclined his head toward the Sannin. Thanks again for that one." "My pleasure. One thing that battle made clear is that we have a long way to go if we want to be really effective as a ninja. I've been thinking about it for a good while, and I know I'm not the only one. So, ideas, people. Relying on luck isn't something we want to be known for." Nico was the first to raise his hand. "We need some form of protocol for a situation like this one." "What?" That wasn't what Naruto had been expecting. "This is the second time we learned about a battle happening from clones dying in combat," the spying advisor continued. "While it couldn't be helped during the invasion, a simple message to the rest of us last time would have gained us nearly an hour in response time, which is enormous." The three adult ninja around the table nodded at that. "Not only that," Kyuha added as he rose. "But we also need a specific code for emergencies like this. The Hokage was in a meeting, and we could have lost time for nothing if we hadn't suspected what he'd answer. A quick way to contact Jiraiya in case of emergencies wouldn't be amiss, either." At this, said Sannin lowered his head at the memory. He clearly remembered what he'd been doing when Sara found him. Naruto was silent for a moment, then nodded. "Good point. Nico, I'm putting you in charge of this. Meet with the others and write out a communication protocol for emergencies." Next. Muramura was the one who rose this time. "We need to master more techniques seamlessly. We would have been completely screwed if we'd had our hands paralyzed." Everyone nodded to that. "We need better defensive techniques for clones. The chakra shield doesn't cut it. We have to get a way to immobilize opponents, especially fast ones. We need something to take down people who can tank most attacks." Whoa. Naruto exclaimed, trying calm people down. One at the time. Miromaru, since sealless techniques are something you can train on outside this place, I'm putting you in charge of that. You three, he pointed to the trio of clones who just spoken out. You're in charge of techniques. I'm expecting at least 6 different ones in total, since we might not manage a few as we did last time. Everyone who has suggestions, talk to these 3 after the meeting. All the hands went down as the blonde genin finished his proclamation. Any other details? You should practice summoning more. Everyone turned toward Ichibo, who was standing on Ariko's head. We're listening, Naruto replied for the group. From what I heard, one of the main issues at first was the fact that you were stuck underground, and that your earth-moving technique wasn't enough to make an exit. Nods all around. Well, earth specialists are common in the Bunny clan among those that practice ninjutsu. Summoning one of those would have made escaping a lot easier. Naruto couldn't deny that. I have to agree with the rabbit here, Jiraiya added from his seat. If you're gonna be the rabbit sage one day, you need to know the clan you've joined. Who are the rabbits and what are their talents? Who should you call in specific situations? I'll take care of that, Ariko said, raising her hand. I'm the one who spends the most time with Ichibo outside. Might as well make something out of it. Can you bleed? Another clone at the table pointed out. A second later, Ariko's hand went back down as her face lowered. I'll have to take care of that one myself. Ariko, if you can go over the members of the rabbit clan with Ichibo before I start summoning them, that would already be helpful. Both the female clone and the rabbit nodded in approval. The boy then looked around. Anything else anyone wants to bring up? A recommendation, if you will, the Sandane said. Go ahead. The man rose. Since number aren't an issue, I'd suggest that there should always be a clone team close in case you need support. That way, if you 3 are taken out by surprise, a rescue group is at least close at hand. Yeah, Naruto said, dejected. I'd thought about that also. He didn't like the fact that he'd made things worse with bad decisions. Remember one thing, Iruka spoke up as he saw Naruto's face. You made it through. Sure, there were wrong choices and questionable actions, but the important part is that you made it, and can learn from it. He waved around. There isn't anybody here who never made a bad decision. That's just being human. But as long as it helps you improve, it's already that much earned, he said with a smile. He wasn't the only one. Both Jiraiya and Hiruzen nodded at that, similar smiles on their lips. Nothing more? Naruto finally said after a moment. Meeting adjourned. We'll be expecting reports from everyone on their tasks next week. Dismissed. The 3 adults instantly vanished, being clones, while the rest of the group quickly made their way downstairs. Naruto wasn't far behind. If he hurried, he might manage to reach Ichiraku before Tsuchi closed shop. 11 days without Ichiraku ramen had been more than enough fasting, and he had a date with the largest bowl he could find. Prank Day 184. Uzumaki, a voice said, coming from right behind him. Naruto turned away from his ramen to find Uchiha Sasuke coming his way. He nearly replied his usual team, but suddenly realized his former rival had actually used his name, and not one of insults he usually bandied about. Uchiha, he finally replied, unsure of what else to say. The dark-haired boy took that as an invitation, and sat down beside him at the counter. He even ordered a plate of tomatoes as he did so. Now even more confused, he released a burst of chakra, hoping to break whatever illusion he was under. No such luck. Just back from your first C rank from what I've heard, correct? Sasuke said between 2 slices of tomato. The great Uchiha doing normal conversation? Impossible. Naruto had to force himself not to check that the sky was falling. He simply nodded instead, taking another bite of his noodles. How was it for you? The Uchiha asked. For a second, Naruto didn't know what to say. The happenings in Fumotocho hadn't yet been released to the general public, and there was enough information under seal that he didn't know what to answer. You had your own C ranks, so I'm pretty sure you know the drill by now, he evasively replied instead. Sasuke looked up to the sky. Long, boring and seemingly pointless? Naruto simply nodded, even though it hadn't been anything like that. I hear you. Naruto finished his bowl in silence while Sasuke snacked beside him. He was pretty sure this meeting wasn't a coincidence, and he wanted to get at the bottom of it. Thank you for the meal, he said to Iam as he pushed back his bowl on the counter. Are you busy after this? Sasuke asked as soon as his bowl was gone. The blonde had expected a request like this one. Not particularly. He was headed down below for more training, but it wasn't anything pressing. And he was wondering what could have made Sasuke become civil out of the blue. You up for a spar? The Uchiha asked, smirking as he usually had. Naruto remembered that he'd hated that smirk, but now for some reason it didn't have the impact it had before. He thought for a moment. While he'd trained a lot, the number of people he'd sparred against was minimal. Outside his clones, only Iruka had been a frequent training partner. Add to that a few sessions with Ebisu, and that was the sum total of his sparring experience ever since he'd graduated. A new challenger might be a good reference point, especially one his age. Sure. What kind? Ninjutsu, Kenjutsu, Taijutsu? The smirk just grew. All of it. Some alarm bells started ringing in Naruto's mind. Why? He finally asked. I heard about your performance during the invasion, he answered, scowling somewhat. And that you were promoted because of it. I just wanted to know how I compared to that. Naruto was sure there was something else there, but he lost nothing in humoring his former classmate. Okay. When and where? He said, gesturing to his own lack of equipment. Sasuke thought for a moment. How about training ground 19 at 2? Naruto nodded. I'll be there. Good, Sasuke said with the slightest hint of a smile. He quickly ate the rest of his snack, paid for his meal and left. Naruto did the same. He had a little more than an hour to get ready, and he planned on being as prepared as he could. At the academy, Sasuke had always been one to go for victory at all costs, and Naruto wasn't planning on losing this one. Naruto wasn't the only one to have come prepared. The Uchiha had 2 more bandoliers of kunai and shuriken on his sides, along with what looked like a pocket full of explosive tags. He was stretching himself from left to right, preparing himself for quick movement. He stopped as soon as the blonde arrived within 4 paces of him. You need time to prepare? Naruto shook his head. He'd never need it, and he wasn't going to start now. Ready when you are, he answered with a smile. He had to agree that he was looking forward to this match. The Uchiha had won all spars they'd had at the academy, and it would be a good measure of his growth since then. Said Ninja withdrew a single kunai. We start when this touches the ground, okay? Naruto nodded. Sasuke threw the kunai high in the air, then took position. He did the same, and the two stuck to the pose for the couple of seconds it took for the kunai to reach the ground. When it did, Sasuke dashed forward instantly, then redirected his charge in an instant to come from the side. The blonde wasn't surprised, he'd done the same many times at the academy. He dodged the first 2 punches, rolled under the kick, then stepped back to evade a second one. 3 quick parries with his Bakuto followed, as Sasuke launched a trio of kunai in quick succession. It was clear Sasuke was testing him, and he was doing the same. His former rival was faster than when they'd last fought, but he had no problem in keeping up with him. My turn, Naruto said, and it was he that charged this time. He launched himself in what was basically his 4th kata, and by the 3rd strike Sasuke had a kunai in hand to block the various strikes. Naruto didn't let the pressure fall, he even tried to place a punch in the middle, as Iruka had done on him, but the dark-haired boy noticed, flipping back at the last instant. and then he was blind. Genjutsu? Naruto wondered. He'd not seen Sasuke do the seals. Still, he needed to react. He stepped to the side to dodge the 3 shuriken he could hear coming, then swiped his blade straight at Sasuke once he could hear the boy was in range. By the sound the dark-haired boy had made, he hadn't been expecting that, and had thrown himself to the side to evade. This gave him enough time to make a Genjutsu dissipation seal. Kai. Nice one, Naruto said as he turned to the rising Sasuke. The Uchiha had his serious face on, and his fingers were moving into seals. Seals he recognized, and his own fingers moved to counter. Katan, Gokaku no Jutsu. Katan, Akaraka Jigoki. The black sphere appeared just as Sasuke turned to exhale, and the flame he spat quickly vanished inside the darkness of the ball. What is that? That? He yelled. Like I'm gonna tell in the middle of combat, Naruto replied, shifting the sphere to his offhand and pulling his sword up once more. Had enough? The Uchiha scowled. No. He launched a brace of shuriken with his answer, and dashed toward the trees that surrounded their practice area. Like most training grounds in Konoha, Area 19 was surrounded on 3 sides by woods. Sasuke quickly disappeared into those, vanishing into the underbrush. Rushing to the edge of the forested area, Naruto stopped to listen, trying to sense his foe. As usual, Sasuke was good, there wasn't a sound out of place, and he couldn't feel his sparring partner anywhere. It was the perfect setup for an ambush or a trap. And he knew how to deal with those. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. A wave of clones rushed forward, and Naruto made sure to follow as if he was one of the many clones. His black ball changed hands to a clone on his left, and a few more hellfire spheres appeared in the group, summoned by the clones. And that happened just in time, as a number of smaller fireballs shot outwards from deeper in the woods. Spread out. He yelled as 2 of the clones with spheres rushed forward. The flames were quickly absorbed, but the shuriken they hit weren't, and the 2 Bunshin burst as their spheres exploded at the contact. Another wave of clones replaced them, but by now Sasuke had clearly changed position. Sasuke Uchiha forced himself not to pant as he hid in the trees, having just done a quick shunshin after a fireball. Around him, he could hear the many Narutos slowly canvassing the place, looking for his position. It had been at least 15 minutes since he'd entered the forest, and they hadn't let up. He was tiring. He knew his reserves were greater than most genin, especially after Kakashi's grueling training, but he was still running out of chakra. He was also down to 3 kunai, and less than half his tags. His shuriken were long gone, and Naruto was now wise to most of his tricks. Which never worked twice. Whatever he'd thought of the boy in the past, he couldn't deny that this wasn't the dead last he'd faced at the academy. His sword work was tight and effective, even in a wooded area where obstacles were everywhere. His reactions were fast, and he knew how to use his jutsu well. Even by sneak attack, his clones took 3 or 4 hits before they went down, and by now they went everywhere in teams of 3, cutting down that option. Kakashi had been right, unless they made a mistake, taking on those trios was a losing proposition. He couldn't see how he could win this one. It hurt inside to admit, but he was losing. And worse was, even if he managed to win, it would be more luck than anything, and it wouldn't satisfy him. Naruto had taken all he could deal, and had come out on top. It was. A squirrel dropped down on the branch he was hiding on, and he kicked it near instantly as he reacted. The beast disappeared in a burst of smoke, and he knew he was found. Shit. He did a quick shunshin 4 meters away, only for a quartet of what he supposed were clones to appear instantly around him. Grabbing 2 kunai, he rushed the closest, who managed to block or dodge the first 7 strikes. The 8th burst him, but he found himself surrounded by clones holding explosive tags at chest height. You're out, Sasuke, Naruto's voice came from deeper in the woods. Fabako Hajin. He didn't know the technique, but the arm tags were bad enough. He supposed he had enough for another pair of shushin, but outside of that he was dry. And he didn't think he could manage a reversal. "I surrender," he spat out, grimacing. He let his kunai drop from his hands as he said so. The clones did a couple of seals before removing the tags, and they stepped back as another Naruto came forward. "Good spar," the Naruto said, and Sasuke suspected it was the original. "I lost," the Uchiha spat out, as if it explained everything. "Yeah, and?" Naruto countered. "I know I learned a lot from this spar. That hiding shuriken in Fireball's trick, it was great, and you might have gotten me with it if you'd used it earlier." "Good for you," the Uchiha growled out. "You can't tell me you learned nothing from this spar," Naruto countered. "Yeah, like what?" Sasuke said, looking down at his training partner. Said Blonde raised a single finger. "Well, you at least know what to work on. First, you clearly need better endurance," he pointed out, then raised a second finger. "Your speed at hand seals is good, so a quick jutsu for close range would be a good addition. Third finger. Some trap training might be useful, also. It probably wouldn't have worked on me, since it's one of my specialties, but you could have made that forest a lot more difficult to hunt you in, and your talent with wires makes it a natural progression of your skill set. Fourth. Some blind fighting training might be useful also. I could tell you used mostly your eyes for sensing, and since you're an Uchiha that's a big flaw." "That's all?" Sasuke replied, clearly unhappy. "And where would I find such a jutsu?" "Well, your sensei is Kakashi of 1,000 jutsu, so I'm pretty sure he has at least one or two that fit those criteria," Naruto countered. "Now, you want another match?" "Nah," Sasuke replied, ambling away from the training ground, going straight for home. He didn't need to be hammered into the ground once more and, judging by how tired he was, he wouldn't be giving his best anyway. "See you then," Naruto replied cheerfully. "Come again for another spar someday." Yeah. His head was down and he was stuck in his thoughts all the way back to the Uchiha district. He felt like he'd fallen back miles from being ready to face his brother. If the so-called dead last could beat him after less than a year, how much behind was he, and how could he ever catch up to Itachi? Clearly, Kakashi wasn't helping him improve fast enough if Naruto could have so easily passed him. He needed more. But who else could he go to for training? Prank Day 187. Torah sat down on the pillow reserved for him in the underground chamber that Jin Shippo never left. Behind him were the rest of the leaders of the taurusen, each seated in his own spot. Before him, on her throne-like chair, was the Lord Jin herself, with her two most loyal retainers beside her. "So," the Lord said, her voice firm. "How goes our people?" "There." Torah started, his head bowed. "There hasn't been a change, Jin-sama. While the taurusen have been guarding the city, and there have been no serious altercations. A few drunks here and there. The people are still fearful and reticent. Shops are empty at near all times, and the streets are deserted. It is clear that they don't believe the Yakuza are gone, only that this is the calm before the storm, and they hide as if it was soon to come. Outside of the Yakuza themselves being captured, I do not think this will change anytime soon." "Disappointing," the Lord replied. "And how goes finding them?" "We do have some leads, Jin-sama, but everything points toward the bulk of our enemies not being in the city at the moment," Torah replied. "Moreover, we've heard rumors of a meeting, which might explain why they are gone. There were infiltrators as rats and mice in the few shops they discovered were Yakuza fronts, but these were nearly abandoned with only a few members still inside, and no one that could be termed leadership. There are a few businesses that we've identified as Yakuza fronts, but these are silent as any, and we found nothing illegal when searched." "Any person we could use as a source of information?" she asked. Torah shook his head. "None, Jin-sama. Whoever was left behind is either an unmarked member or hired help, and wouldn't be high enough in the ranks to have important information. So we are waiting." "Sadly, yes, Jin-sama," Torah answered. "There is no crime we can crack down on in the city, and outside sending troops to seek our enemies, there is not much more we can do. Shippu inclined her head. Should we do that? No, Torah instantly replied, shaking his head. The members of the taurusen behind him did the same, echoing his thoughts. It may be exactly what our enemies are waiting for. Like the population of the city, I do not believe this is over. Splitting our forces would only help our enemies if they returned. He didn't say that they'd already done exactly that. While the official members of the taurusen stayed in Jincho, there were Naruto clones going all over the peninsula. Numbers were their strength, and they'd use it as much as possible. It hadn't given any results yet, but they were sure it would. Question was, would it be in time? Chapter 29, Retribution. Prank Day 190. Gaara knew the nighttime desert better than anyone else. His insomnia had made it so that he'd lived long hours after sunset simply appreciating the solitude of the sands. He knew the sounds of the desert wind better than the words of his own father. He could tell much simply by being there and listening. That was how he knew he had company. And who that company was, specifically. Hello, Naruto, he called out, his eyes closed. Hello yourself, Gaara, the clone replied. Gaara knew very well this wasn't the real one, but he had no reason to treat him otherwise. Simple relaxation or training this time? The Konoha genin asked. Training, the Ichibi's jailer replied, raising a sand clone from the ground. A ninja must always strive to better himself, must he not? He didn't say that he'd recently been put on the short list of possible candidates to replace the Yondaime Kazekage. He didn't know how his friend would take it, with his own ambitions. Mind if I watch? The clone asked. Gaara shook his head. I told you I didn't mind your presence, and I am not practicing anything particularly dangerous today. Just verifying, Naruto replied, sitting down. Gaara spent the next hour building sand clones, both singularly and in groups. The Naruto clone was now a quatuor, and they were training in their own way. 3 were juggling those black spheres Gaara had seen before, while the last was watching his own training. Are you always training your sand, Gaara? That clone finally asked. The sand boy nodded. It is what I am best at, he countered. Yeah, but it can't be useful in all the situations, the Kage Bunshin replied. Like, if you're fighting at sea or something. Or against attacks that can go through your defenses, another clone pointed out as he caught and sent back a trio of balls. Gaara had to admit he'd never thought about it. He'd rarely been sent outside the village, and never for longer than during the recent Chunin exam. And within the desert, he was deadly at every range. Are you sure? He couldn't think of his reliance on sand as a weakness. Even in Konoha, there was enough sand around him that he could gather the equivalent of his gourd in a few moments, if necessary. Sure. I had my own wake-up call about relying on a limited number of techniques, he replied, not saying anything more. Gaara thought for a moment, reviewing his time in Konoha mentally. He didn't remember much of the time after he'd tried releasing the Ichibi, but he knew that the boy who'd been fighting him hadn't been defeated, having retreated instead after a long battle. But the time before that was clear and painful. He'd been a punching bag for the Konoha genin, having neither the speed nor the strength to do anything but take the blows. If training in a different way could prevent such a situation from happening again, he was all for it. What do you recommend? He asked, stepping up to where the clones were. The 4 clones looked at each other for a moment and nodded in concert. The many spheres were caught and burst on purpose, feeding the flames inside into the last remaining ball. Any specifics? The clone said, rising. None that come to mind. He thought for a moment. Your sand skin is automatic and doesn't need anything to remain active, right? He asked. Gaara shook his head. Not as far as I know. I'd had it since forever, and before you came around, I've never had it taken off. Good, he said. Then, I'd recommend starting with exactly what Rock Lee used, Taijutsu. That surprised the Suna child. Why that in particular? Well, first, it's clearly not something you've put much attention in. Gaara nodded at that, as he couldn't really deny it. And with better speed and endurance, everything one trains in gets better. But what really makes Taijutsu interesting for you, is that you already have an advantage over most people in the form of your natural armor. Also, another clone pointed out, with your current skill set, staying at a distance from you gives you the advantage, unless they have armor-piercing, long-range attacks. So, most people would rush to close range, hoping to take control over the battle's rhythm and stop you from using your sand. Improving your taijutsu would give you a much better chance to survive encounters like those. Gaara thought for a moment, then nodded. It made sense. How should I go about it? You haven't learned a style at your academy? Naruto asked. Academy? He countered. Never mind, the clone replied, stepping opposite to Gaara. We'll simply see where you're at. A spar with no jutsu, no weapons, no sand. He took a combat posture. I'll be on the defensive first. Come at me. It took a moment before Gaara understood what the Naruto Bunshin meant. The following charge was weak, and his blows weren't anything to write home about. A lot of people had said of Naruto's original style that it was the one of a street brawler, but Gaara's wasn't even that. It was like he had no clue how to hurt people with his hands and feet. The only good thing Naruto could say about his fellow Jinchuriki was that he didn't tire, hitting and hitting without stopping. Clearly, they had their work cut out for them. Prank Day 192. Good day, students. Ebisu said cheerfully, which was a complete contrast to his appearance. He had a black eye and a sizable bruise on the opposite side of his face. Today we will be starting on a new form of training. The etiquette training is done, then? Naruto asked. He might understand its use more now than before, but that didn't make it any more interesting. The special Jonin shook his head. No, this will be added to our training schedule and not replace any of our current subjects. And what is this new training? Muramaru asked. Elemental ninjutsu, Ebisu exclaimed. Nice. Naruto exclaimed, only to be silenced by a hand sign from his teacher. More specifically, he explained. We will be finding out what is each of your elemental affinities and, as such, what form of elemental ninjutsu you can use. Ariko raised her hand. Can't everyone use every type of element? The Naruto clone knew jutsu of each type, and while it had taken time to master them, they could indeed use them all. Ebisu nodded. Indeed, it is possible to learn jutsu of every element. However, people tend to have a particular ease with one or more forms of elemental shaping. He looked at the three in turn. For genin like you three, it is better to start learning with the element that will come the easiest. And, how is this training done? Muramaru asked. First this, Ebisu said, withdrawing a set of small paper sheets from one of his pockets. He then handed each of the genin one. How does that work? Naruto asked, looking from one side of the sheet to the other. Not like that, he said, taking Naruto's hand. He then placed the paper square right on his palm. Now, channel some chakra into the paper. Naruto did as ordered, and, slowly but surely, the paper cut itself down the middle. Is that normal? Naruto asked. Ebisu nodded. It is one of the possible results of this exercise, the special Jonin explained. The paper cutting itself like this means that your primary elemental affinity is with wind. He scratched his chin. I am surprised, I have to admit. Based on your black sphere jutsu, I would have expected you to be of a fire nature. Wind is the very opposite of fire, and the rarest element to be found within Konoha's borders. Muramaru gulped at those words. If wind was Naruto's base element, then the two of them as Kage Bunshin would probably have the very same. And if it was the rarest here, 3 people on the same team with that element would clearly indicate something was going on. Ariko just smiled toward Muramaru, as if she knew what he was thinking, and stepped up to their teacher. She put the paper in her palm and focused. Instantly, the paper started wrinkling. That means? She asked. This is the result when used by someone with affinity with lightning techniques, Ebisu said with a nod. He then turned toward his last student. And you, Muramaru? The boy racked his head for a second, trying to find a solution, when he understood what Ariko had done. He put the paper in his hand and focused as if he was trying to feed flame into one of their spheres. The paper instantly ignited and turned to ash. Fire, I suppose? He said, hoping that another result wasn't expected. Indeed, he replied. I must say, I have a very offensively minded team. Why is that? Ariko asked. These three particular elements are well known to be used mostly offensively, especially compared to the other two who are mainly defensively oriented, he explained. In particular, the wind element has numerous cutting techniques, as well as wind blasts at longer ranges. Fire is self-explanatory, as combustion is naturally damaging, and lightning techniques are well known for their armor-piercing properties. Now, gather round. We'll go over how each element interacts with the others. Prank Day 196. Okay, so that's it for the spy network, Naruto said, turning toward the other side of the table. Anybody have anything else to add on the subject? Silence was the only answer. Jiraiya had to admit he liked being part of these council meetings. Being made near entirely of clones, there wasn't the usual politics and manipulations inherent with humans trying to one-up each other for hierarchy purposes. Here the hierarchy was clear, and no one tried to put himself forward for more credit or to protect himself. As such, he'd made sure to have a clone present at every meeting since he'd been invited. Watching his godson slowly become an important part of the Leaf military system was something he wouldn't have missed for the world. It was also a breath of fresh air compared to the other meetings Hirozen had brought him to. So, techniques, the real Naruto said, turning and pointing to a trio of Bunshin on his left side. Your show. We're still going through everything, the middle one said, rising. Our primary selection of techniques got us 23 possibles, and we're currently going over. He then stopped, his face blanking up for a moment. In fact, Jiraiya noticed that particular clone wasn't the only one. Every Naruto's face had instantly frozen. What? They exclaimed as one. Jiraiya had no clue what, but something had clearly just happened. He supposed a clone had just burst or sent a message, and said message wasn't anything good. What's happening? The many Narutos ignored him, rushing out of their chairs. One even transferred himself across the room with a kawarimi, and he had the door halfway open when Naruto interrupted everyone. Stop! He yelled, updating everyone with a hand seal. All the clones obeyed, stopping instantly. What are you saying? One of the council members countered. It was clear from Naruto's face that he was holding himself back from doing something violent. His hands were gripping the table tightly, and Jiraiya could feel the strength of his godson's chakra lashing out. We already have a clone present and helping. More of us won't be much of a help. He turned toward Janae. You're the one here closest to him from the merchant network, correct? Janae nodded. Go. Find out what you can. The merchant jumped out of his seat and ran out. What's happening? The Sandaime asked. Jiraiya had to admit he was also curious. He'd never seen Naruto so angry. He turned to the Hokage, face blank. Ichiraku is burning, he answered simply, his voice filled with wrath. When Janae arrived, the fire was at least under control. He could see a couple of clones with black spheres inside, keeping the flames from advancing. As such, he went directly toward Tucci, who was standing with his daughter on the side of the road. Are you and I am okay? He asked. He had a flashback of earlier this year when these same positions were reversed. He liked it even less than last time. Tucci didn't look at him, keeping his eyes on the still-burning Ichiraku ramen. I'm fine. I am too. The restaurant, however. Tochi didn't need to continue. It was clear that the building was a near-complete loss. You have insurance, at least? Jine seemed to remember that the building was insured from one of the many conversations the two had about their respective businesses. No, the chef replied sadly. My insurance company changed hands recently, and my coverage was suspended pending an investigation of the building. Jine scowled. After what had happened to the warehouse with his own goods, he didn't believe in coincidences anymore. Especially not after a dozen or so customers canceled their own orders in the last few weeks. A pair had even closed, and he'd not thought of checking into the reasons. He had the feeling that the false ANBU had moved into a new phase of their offensive. Anything I can do? Jine asked. I don't know, the man finally answered. I can't. He fell to his knees. Jine took a deep breath and forced himself not to react. To Tochi, he was a business partner and not much more. He didn't know that one of the few safe places of his younger times was burning right before him. Contact me if there's anything I can do. You know I have contacts. He put one hand on Tochi's shoulder and one on Iam's. You'll get through this. His only answer was a sad nod. The merchant clone then turned back and vanished in an alley between two buildings. He made sure he wasn't observed, and his hands flashed into the usual cross seal. Get me Nico, he called out, rage evident in his tone. There's something rotten in Konoha, and we're going to get to the bottom of it. Jiraiya curved around the burnt counters, stepping inside what was formerly Ichiraku ramen. Most of the building by now was covered with tarps, hiding the interior. So what happened? The Toad Hermit asked the first clone that came in sight. Fire, evidently, he said with a scowl. From what Ichiraku said, it started in the back, where spices and alcohols were stored. He tried extinguishing it, but water didn't do anything. Jiraiya didn't like the sound of that. Show me where. The clone leads him deeper in the building, past a few other Naruto. There were still flames here and there, but they slowly faded, their heat drawn into spheres. Here, the clone said, pointing. The Sannin wasted no time in crouching, pressing a finger on the ground and looking at the results. He then rose and went around the room, looking at the walls above head height. It didn't take long for him to find a spot that was still wet. He tasted it. He then scowled. Mist oil, he said as he spat to the ground. Mist oil? Naruto repeated. A clever mix of oil, petrol, tar and alcohol that the Mist Ninja invented. Only they know the exact proportions, though most villages have their own version. Mist's is the most effective, the Sannin explained. Unless you use massive amounts of liquid, throwing water at it is only going to spread it more. He looked around. Not something anybody can get their hands on. Any clue why someone would use it on a civilian target like Tochi? He's been helping the merchant network, finding customers in Konoha, the clone replied. Most of them canceled their orders in the last few weeks. Some of your own contacts did the same, actually, he added. Jiraiya turned toward him. That's very interesting, he replied. Can you tell me who? The clone gave him the name of 2 brothels, and of a single bar in Konoha. I'll be checking on those myself, if you don't mind, the Sannin said. Go right ahead, the Bunshin replied. We have more than enough on our side to occupy ourselves. Jiraiya turned to walk out, stopping in what had been the door frame. Meeting tonight? The clone nodded seriously. Meeting tonight. Be seeing you then. He said as he left. Tochi had been a close ally of Naruto, and that for years. Jiraiya wasn't going to leave a single stone unturned on this subject. Luckily, most of his contacts were open late. He'd thought better from the owner of the Shadow's Rest, and he was going to get to the bottom of this. Prank Day 197. The atmosphere of the council room wasn't the same today. Iruka had been present yesterday when Naruto had dropped his bombshell, but he hadn't had anything he could say. While Ichiraku ramen had been one of his favorite places to eat in, he'd never been as close to Totchi as Naruto had been. He'd made sure to go and offer his condolences to the man during his lunch break, but there wasn't much he could do. Not while being head teacher at the academy. Iruka had been one of the first in, knowing the path by heart now. As such, he was present when everyone got in and took their seats. The various Naruto clones were somewhere between sad and angry as a rule, while Jiraiya was scowling at something. Only the Hokage was anything normal, and even then, his usual smile at the proceeding wasn't present. Okay, Naruto said from his place as Kyuha, who was the last member in this time, fell into his chair. The blonde genin instantly turned to his right. "Jinne, what happened?" The merchant clone rose, and tiredness was evident in his body language. "I'm pretty sure that, by now, everyone here knows what happened yesterday to Ichiraku." Nods all around, including Ichibo. "We had Nico and other clones going around, both looking into what happened and the surrounding situation in Konoha. In short, along with the false ANBU from before, whoever is behind this is also buying out Konoha businesses by the dozens, and using them to put pressure on the rest," Jinne explained. Hiruzen joined Jiraiya in scowling. "What kind of businesses?" Jinne withdrew a sheet of paper. "Here's the list." He passed it around. With 27 entries, it was well past the single dozen. Iruka looked it over but recognized only half. They were insurance companies, banks and other such businesses. There were also a few equipment suppliers. The rest seemed mainly like import places and production facilities. Jiraiya gave the sheet a quick look, then passed it on. "On my side, 3 of my contacts in Konoha reported being closed for health citations and having problems with the inspectors. I checked to the places, and I couldn't find any issues present," he said. "And I don't need to be a spy master to see something wrong there. Bribes, probably." "So, you're saying someone's fighting us with money?" the real Naruto asked. "Essentially," Jiraiya answered. "There are no rules in Konoha about buying or creating businesses, as the village tries to encourage trade and growth." "And how do you fight that?" Naruto asked. "There are rules about ninja implication into civilian markets," Hiruzen pointed out. "I'm not going to send ninja against civilians, not without any proof of treason at least." Naruto shook his head. "That's not what I meant." "With money," Jiraiya replied. "The same methods that are being used against you can also be used against them. Like the Akamichi did when the Shuro tried buying out their restaurants. That was the first Naruto heard of something like that. Knowing what was generally the result when someone got between Choji and food, it can't have been pretty." "What happened?" "The Akimichi pooled their money and bought them out instead," Jiraiya replied. "And where they couldn't, they bought the suppliers, or opened businesses that undercut their opponents. Within a year, the Shuro family was gone from Konoha, and everything they'd owned was in Akamichi hands." He looked to the full council. "We have the money. Anybody here opposed to doing the same thing?" The many clones shook their heads, while Jiraiya smiled viciously. Iruka sighed but said nothing, knowing that Naruto wouldn't take an attack on Ichiraku any other way. The Hokage rose, withdrawing himself from the council. "This isn't a ninja issue, and as such I'll keep my hands off it." You don't agree?" Naruto said, face falling. Jiraiya was the one that answered. "No," he replied. "As Hokage, he isn't allowed to involve him into these kinds of economic affairs, at least not outside of certain situations such as wars and the like." "Naruto," he said from the room's threshold. He then looked into Naruto's eyes and nodded. "Good luck," he said, closing the door behind him. Silence reigned for a moment. "You know that this'll draw the attention of whoever's attacking your suppliers, right?" Iruka pointed out. Naruto's smile was vicious. "Let them come." Prank Day 199. With the Merchant Council going into economic offensive, the call had gone for clones to gather money. They might have an enormous nest egg with Gaara's resources, but Jiraiya had been clear that battles like this one were won by those who had the most means, and the Naruto clones didn't want to leave anything to chance. With most of the clones outside Konoha having jobs, there was already a steady flow of money going in. While their individual salaries weren't anything large, the sheer number of clones meant that this was still a tidy sum. And there were places where money flowed much quicker. Full house, queens over nines, for Tenko Midori. The dealer said. Anyone has better? The men around the table grumbled and folded. The dealer pushed the pot toward Midori, who added it to her already sizable winnings. She was already had more than 100,000 Ryo worth of chips, and she was still going strong. Before the last few days, the Naruto clones weren't much into gambling. While they hadn't been rich for most of their lives, money hadn't really been the issue. Finding places that would allow a Naruto to buy stuff was much more of a problem. And with the money they'd made off Gaara and their trading network, even that was a thing of the past. As such, money hadn't been much of a priority. Added to that was the fact that casinos were very often depressing places. While the rich who came weren't an issue, there were always people of modest means trying to make it out through chance. And that rarely worked. Because of that, the many Narutos had only frequented casinos socially with others and not otherwise. Operation Buyout had changed that. There were now a rotating group of clones in Tanzakagai, going from place to place and winning money. Their luck still hadn't deserted them, and the Naruto clones made millions daily in total from the casinos. Another hand? The dealer asked. Midori nodded, as did two of the men at the table, but the last pushed his chair back. I'm out. I'll take that chair, then, a female voice interrupted. Good, good. The dealer said, his smile abnormally large. This table is 5-card draw, Densetsu no Kamo-sama. Will that be okay with you? Fine by me, she replied, pulling out a stack of chips. Midori didn't need to be told who that was. With Jiraiya as a sensei and after having met Orochimaru, the Bunshin had made sure to gather information about the last member of the Sannin, Tsunade. It wasn't good reading. The female Sannin had lost much more than the other two, and had basically given up. While Naruto wasn't one to give up, he couldn't say he'd lost as much as the granddaughter of the Shodame, and not in the way that she did. Still, she was undercover, and as such she wasn't to draw attention. She simply continued playing as if she was facing any other opponent. And continued winning. Betting against Tsunade was bizarre. She always called and never folded, even if she had a handful of junk. Midori wasn't sure, but it also seemed like she was satisfied with losing for some reason. There were some players like that, mostly rich men and women who were here mainly for the challenge, but she didn't seem like those. It was more as if, by losing, she made sure of something. Puzzling. Tsunade also didn't give up, not before the casino closed for the night. From there she went straight to the nearest bar and started drinking. And, the next day, she was back at the table as if nothing had happened. After the third day of such, she made an extra clone to follow Tsunade. She might be a gambler and a drunkard, but she was still one of the Sannin. And Jiraiya might be interested by what was happening to his former teammate. Prank Day 201. Torah had the night shift. As leader of the taurusen, that was what he'd selected. After the long nights he'd had canvassing Wade for signs of Gaara, he'd not easily been able to go back to a day shift. And since he was the leader, he had the ability to decide. And nights it was. The situation in Jin hadn't changed, either for better or for worse. The tension was still there, and the former Yakuza businesses were of no use in figuring out what was happening. Worse still, the spreading network had no better idea of what was going on. Clones had spread all over the peninsula, and no sign of the missing Yakuza had been found. In fact, outside the Jin region, there was no organized crime of any kind, something that the many Narutos found surprising. Normally, things like that spread from place to place. Here, it was limited only in Jin. The night shift also had a specific advantage: he could train more easily. After a few days, the Jin retainers had gotten accustomed to the presence of the taurusen, and had left most of the security issues to those specialized in it. Their lack of numbers had helped. By the time the taurusen had arrived in Jin, there were barely a dozen of them left. Being alone at night meant that those on the guard shift could practice techniques that no samurai should have knowledge of. Each of those guarding had their own peculiar aspect they were training in. Torah, on his side, was trying to mix kenjutsu with the sharp fist. Channeling chakra down his blade was still something he didn't have down, but he was at least making progress. Well, he was until a scream interrupted his training. He reacted instantly, opening the door and dashing inside. He didn't hesitate, going straight toward the sound, while the two others present stood in the door, blocking the only path out of the room. No, no, no. He could hear Lord Jin yell out. He didn't stop a moment, barreling behind the screen that separated her throne room from her bedroom. No. He arrived at Lord Jin's bedside with sword drawn, ready to cut whoever it was that was attacking in half. Only, there was nobody. No. Lord Jin continued screaming, clearly having a nightmare. Daddy, no. Torah sheathed his sword and sat Saiza beside the Lord's bed. Wake up, Lord Jin, he said softly. You are having a nightmare. That didn't stop her. After 3 similar tries, he shook her shoulder lightly, hoping to break her out of her nightmare. She reacted instantly, jumping back as if she was attacked, eyes wide. Torah withdrew his hand and bowed. I am sorry for my presumption, but you are having a nightmare, Jin-sama. It took a moment before she was able to calm herself and return her breathing to normal. Yes, she finally said. My thanks, Torah-san. He bowed again. I will lead you to your sleep, then. He then rose. Would it be possible for you to stay? She quickly asked. If that is what you wish, Jin-sama, Tota replied. Let me just send your other guards back to their post. He did as he said, quickly messaging the 2 remaining clones of what was happening with hand signs. He then returned to Jin-sama's bedside. What can I do for you, Jin-sama? While we are alone here, you may call me Shippu, Torah-san, she replied. I wouldn't be so presumptuous, Torah replied. It was what he expected a samurai should answer. My father the Lord Jin had a saying, Torah-san, the Lord replied, sniffing. All are equal before sickness, dreams, and to the Shinigami. While I am in my bed like this, treat me as one of your men. I would much prefer it. If that is your will, Shippu-sama, Torah replied. I must say that your father was a wise man. Better, at least, Shippu replied. And yes, he was, she said, her face downcast. How about your own, Torah-san? She asked, clearly trying to change the subject. I never knew him, Shippu-sama, he replied. From what I heard, he died very shortly after my birth. It was the truth, at least as far as he knew. And he supposed he could be true for anyone, not only ninja. I'm sorry, Shippu replied. For bringing up such painful memories. Torah shook his head. No worries, Shippu-sama, he answered. I've long gotten over the fact that I will never know my parents. Shippu's eyes went wide. Parents? Both? Torah nodded. So, you also were raised by retainers, I suppose? Something like that. Tell me your story, Shippu asked. Well, he said, building the story he was going to tell in his mind. It all started on an unlucky day, as a monster attacked our village on the day I was brought into the world. Both my father and mother were warriors, and as such they fought. It was a mix of bits of the stories he'd heard of the many samurai under his command, along with a retelling of his life in Konoha where ninja were replaced by samurai. Actually, some of the parts fit abnormally well. Having Sasuke as a snobbish samurai from a major clan who ended up losing his family to a traitor, Iruka as a strict but warm swordsmanship teacher, and the Hokage as the wise and old shogun, past his prime but still to be reckoned with, seemed just right. Shippo fell asleep halfway through his time at the academy. Torah simply smiled and tucked her in. Sasuke had been someone who'd been serious all the time, and look at what he was now. Talented he was, but there was still something clearly wrong with him. He was glad to see that Shippo could at least put the burden away for a few hours. Still, he kept in place and guarded her bed. He'd at least be there if she had another nightmare. And she needed the sleep. That's it for this reading. Hit like and subscribe for a free ticket pass going to the different worlds of anime fanfictions. Looking forward to having you on board again.